Well, if there's one thing that's been clear from these coalition talk, it's that the ANC and the DA refuse to work together. But coalitions are needed in 5 out of the country's 8 metros, and support dropped for both of these big parties in the municipal polls. But maybe it's time they put their differences aside. That's the argument being put forward by Good Governance Africa researcher Richard Jurgens. He joins us live now to discuss this. Thank you so much, Richard, for your time. I mean, there are several countries that we know of which have coalition party run metros, and they do it very well. It doesn't seem to be an issue. What's the problem with the DA and the ANC not being able to work together?
Well, thanks for having me, Annika. It's a very good question. I think it's obvious that in a certain sense, the main cause of this is a history of entirely oppositional politics and politicking that has dominated the approaches of both parties. And it would appear then that they're unable to find a way of looking at each other as, well, to put it bluntly, fellows.
Sorry, you've had a break up there, Richard. I'm going to ask you a question and see if we can get you back. Richard, can you hear me?
Yes, sorry about that.
Sorry, let's carry on. I mean, the bottom line is that voters are fed up with both big parties because they lost support in this election. So surely it should be a wake-up call for them to try and come together. The problem seems to be, to me, is that coalitions are not being used for service delivery enhancement. They're being used as political prizes.
Yes, no, that's very accurate. I think it's part of the history that I mentioned briefly of entirely oppositional politics and politicking that has shaped the relationship between these two parties. As you said, the local elections resulted in a loss of support to both parties, and we're reading that as an increasing lack of trust among the voters in both local and national politics. And secondly, we read that as voters' indication that above all they want services. That's the job of government, or at least one of the major jobs of government, is to provide services. And those haven't been provided. So I think that the election showed that very clearly.
I mean, we did an interview last week where there is actually a 2-tier system of choice where the Municipal Services Act actually outlines that there doesn't need to be a mayoral exco system. There can actually be a better system where it's more inclusive for all parties. Surely that would make a difference and should be on the table.
Absolutely. I think that's one of the reasons why we at GGA came up with this very strong advocacy for a coalition. Firstly, that the oppositional politics and politicking clearly hasn't worked. So we need to find another solution. And then looking around, we saw that, at least on the national level, coalitions have been a fundamental part of governance in many parts of the world. And they've been very successful. They tend to be used, they might be used to solve a particular political problem in a polity, or they might in fact become embedded in that polity. As for instance in Switzerland, where in effect a coalition of the largest parties is a constitutional requirement. So there are different indications of a need for a coalition. We're saying that the lack of service provision, one of the primary jobs of the government, shows that the oppositional politics has failed, and we need to look for another solution. There are solutions with regard to coalitions.
Very quickly, what happens if by the 18th there hasn't been some coalitions formed in those hung councils, because a speaker has to be nominated by that date, if I understand it correctly?
That's a good question. I can't say specifically what will happen, but I do think that that the indications are that both parties are digging their heels in, and that they're indicating that they are not prepared to work together. I think probably it's going to be the job of civil society to pressure them into doing so. There are tools, processes, and organizations that can help in the formation of coalitions. There's a roadmap for doing so. All of this can be applied and used in the context of making a coalition work in South Africa, and we're saying it's time to make it work.
Will good sense prevail? That's the question. That was Good Governance Africa's researcher, Richard Jurgens. Thank you so much for your time this morning.